Uwe Holmer was a Christian pastor in communist East Germany. He had been converted and followed Jesus as a teenager after he had had to spend 10 long months in a lung clinic because of illness where an older boy told him about Christ. At the age of 24, Uwe's family fled to freedom in West Germany, but Uwe had been training to become a pastor, and so he stayed behind in East Germany because he believed that it would need more pastors. He was ordained the following year. Yet he was frequently under attack by the East German government. From the late 1950s, the head of state security on the East German Politburo, Erich Honecker, began to crack down on any dissent or even criticism within East Germany. It was Honecker who built the Berlin Wall. It was Honecker who gave the order to shoot anyone trying to escape from East Germany. From 1970 on, Honecker took charge of the East German government, essentially ruling the country as its dictator. Under Honecker, the East German Stasi, or secret police, targeted Pastor Holmer. Even though Holmer was a faithful East German citizen, the communist Honecker dictatorship saw him as a threat, as if he were leading a rebellion or simply by existing as a Christian leader. Holmer had certainly expressed some critique of the GDR, particularly over forced collectivization of agriculture, and even just that little bit of critique made him a target. The Honecker regime targeted the pastor's children. He took away their right to attend secondary school despite their good grades, leaving them with only an elementary education. And Pastor Honecker had to look on as his children were targeted by the East German government. He was being treated as if he were leading a rebellion. The student is not above the teacher, nor the servant above the master. He received the same treatment, in one sense, that Jesus himself had undergone in Gethsemane. We're going to read chapter 14 of Mark's Gospel, beginning in verse 42. We pick up where we left off last week. Jesus is still in the garden with his disciples, who are now thankfully awake. And here in 14:42 of the Gospel according to St. Mark, we read, Jesus said, "Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." And going at once to Judas, Jesus said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. The men seized Judas and arrested him. And then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. What are some of the questions we can ask of this text? For some of you, it's a text that you've read a million times, and the risk with that is that a passage of the Bible can just kind of come across as a whole bunch of God talk, and you don't really see what weird kind of stuff is actually happening here, and that causes you to miss the meaning. And if you're here today and you're just used to a sermon being a whole lot of kind of God, Bible, Bible, God, Bible, God, Bible, God, Bible, Church, Jesus, Bible, God, then I hope you can ask some more pointed questions and get some more pointed answers and see Jesus in the midst of this. The first question is, why does Judas feel the need to use subterfuge? Why the need to come out in advance with a plan with this crowd of people? Why bring them with weapons and go up and betray Jesus with a kiss? Why not just show up and say, "That's him right there"? Why does he do it this way? It's totally unnecessary. Jesus is not going to fight back. Am I leading a rebellion? that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Why the subterfuge over identifying who Jesus is? And it can only be because Judas thought that Jesus would turn on him and attack him. And so he can't take the direct route. He has to do the indirect route of letting them know that I'm going to tell you which one you need to arrest by kissing him, so that the armed crowd knows who to arrest without Judas showing his cards, so to speak. See, Judas is assuming that Jesus will fight back. That's why he uses subterfuge. And so he comes with armed men and with this plan. Clearly, Judas doesn't get it. He doesn't understand that Jesus came to die for us and that he will go to his death willingly and he will not raise a finger against those who bring it. Why wasn't, Judas wasn't the only one not getting it at this point. We read that one of the disciples didn't get it either, because we read that one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So somebody was going to fight back. It's one of the disciples, and because he doesn't understand that Jesus came to die in order to purchase our reconciliation with God. So one of the disciples isn't getting it, and we know from John's gospel that it was Peter. Peter sliced off this man's ear. This means Peter wasn't getting it either. Jesus wasn't trying to overthrow the Romans. Am I leading a rebellion, he asks? Jesus wasn't organizing a violent insurrection. The Roman authorities knew Jesus was not a threat to their rule. Our struggle is spiritual in nature, dealing with the massive gulf that exists between a holy God and sinful humanity. You know, Jesus came to die in order that his death would bridge that gulf and reconcile humanity to God. This isn't a political thing about Roman rule. In Ephesians 6, Paul, who was executed by the Romans, said that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's a spiritual battle. And sometimes, you know, even today, in our effort to address the sin and the injustice that we see all around us, we can forget that our basic struggle is not against other people. There are spiritual forces at work, and the gospel, living out the gospel and proclaiming the gospel, is only to be weaponized against those spiritual forces and not against image bearers of God. 2 Corinthians 10, St. Paul says, "For though we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds." His weapons are words of truth about Jesus. The swords, no, not swords to slice off ears. There was no need to bring an armed militia to arrest Jesus because he wasn't trying to overthrow the Romans. Am I leading a rebellion, he asks. He wasn't trying to overthrow the Romans. He wasn't leading a rebellion. Second point, or was he? This is where we look back in hindsight and notice that this is actually a nuanced question. While Jesus is stating that he's not organizing a military insurgency against the Romans, there actually was a revolution that was taking place that he was leading, but it was on a more cosmic scale. Jesus came to upend the way human civilization works. It's a bottom-up revolution instead of a top-down one. Jesus described his kingdom as being like a mustard seed. It starts out tiny, and yet a mustard seed that grows into a huge tree so birds of the air can build nests in it. And that's a mighty big mustard plant, just so you know. But that's the way Jesus' revolution takes place. It starts out tiny, but then it becomes huge. He said it's like yeast that goes into a dough, and at first it's just in that one little tiny spot of the dough, but the yeast has a way of spreading and working its way through the entire lump, and he said eventually it leavens the whole lump. The kingdom of Jesus eventually leavens the whole earth, as the earth eventually becomes covered with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. This is the slow impact that people and communities that follow Jesus and are in relationship with people who follow Jesus experience, not over days or weeks, but over centuries. This revolution of Jesus is the only real revolution that has ever taken place. Every seeming human revolution changes who sits in the seats of power and privilege, but every revolution still keeps the basic structures of fallen human civilization in place. It just changes who sits in which seats. A human revolution doesn't actually change the dynamic between those who have power and those who do not have power, the ruled and the rulers, those who get most of the resources and those who get very few of the resources. Probably the most radical attempt at a human revolution was the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. And in that revolution, the communist Marxist vision was of a world that would see no more difference between the ruled and the rulers, no more inequality, that everybody would live in a peaceful utopia and everything would be great. And that very radical human revolution, what did it change? It was a genuine effort to change the structures, the foundations of civilization, but what happened? Before the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, there were important people in the Kremlin and in St. Petersburg who held all the power, who made all the decisions, and who lived with relative wealth and privilege. And then there were all the other people who had no power, who lived with scarcity and had to do whatever the people in the Kremlin or St. Petersburg told them to do. Then you have this radical revolution. And afterwards, 50 years later, what do you see? After the Bolshevik Revolution, there were the important people in the Kremlin or in St. Petersburg who held all the power, who made all the decisions, and who lived with relative wealth and privilege. And then there were all the other people who had no power, lived with scarcity, and had to do whatever the people in the Kremlin or St. Petersburg told them to do. But lo and behold, then, 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Communism is gone. Free market comes in. There are elections. And what changed? A few decades later, after that revolution, there were the important people in the Kremlin or in St. Petersburg who now hold all the power, who make all the decisions, and who live with relative wealth and privilege. And then there are all the other people who have no power, who live with scarcity and do whatever the people in the Kremlin or St. Petersburg tell them to do. What changed? What changed was just who's sitting in the good seats or the bad seats. But the basic structure of fallen human civilization, what Jesus calls the way the leaders of the Gentiles rule from above, did not change. There's never been a real revolution. Only Jesus has taken on a real revolution that says that the way up is now down, that says that the way to strength lies in weakness, that says that the way to true wealth is by giving it all away. A revolution in which the King of Kings gives his life in exchange for the life of his servant. It's a reversal of the world's values. It's a real revolution that changes the basic structures of fallen human civilization. Jesus is bringing the only real revolution that has ever happened, the first one in human history. And in his revolution, Jesus is reversing the world's values. Jesus is saying to Peter and to the violent mob arresting him and us, listen, my kingdom is not like the kingdoms of this world. My goal here is not to rearrange who sits in the good seats and who sits in the bad seats, who has power and who is weak, who has scarcity and who has wealth. My kingdom changes everything. I'm going to save the world by giving up power instead of by taking power. I'm going to love my enemies. In humility, I'm going to put their interests ahead of my own, even to my death. That's what my kingship means. And when that captures your heart, it's going to change you. My kingdom is all about weakness, not about power. It's about poverty. It's not about money. It's about being rejected, not being respected. See, Rome was all about being powerful, being on the top of the totem pole, being seen to be strong and powerful and making other nations bow down to the glory of Rome. The weak were despised. The weak, it was said, enslaved themselves. They're trampled down. Human life was cheap. You killed rather than be killed, and whatever it took to further your agenda and your family's power, wealth, and honor is what you did. If there were casualties, tough luck. Humility was never a Roman virtue. The Romans lusted for power, anything but being perceived as weak. And you look here at Jesus, he's giving up power. He's going peacefully. He could have killed everybody there with a blink of an eye, but he was choosing to be weak on purpose. He's choosing to suffer to save his enemies. You contrast Jesus' humility and love and his willing loss of power with Rome's lust for power and Judas' desire for money and the Sanhedrin's desire for control. Jesus enables us to give up power because we don't have to have power, because he has power. And his power is made perfect, not in our strength, but in our weakness. He enables us to give up status because we already have status as children of God, and there's nothing that can embellish the resume of Christ as a child of him. We're able to give up wealth because it's just money, and it doesn't really buy happiness, and it's something that we don't need to be important because we're already important to God. And we can give up pleasure, and we can suffer, and suffer willingly, and suffer joyfully, even though it's hard, because Jesus suffered for us, and he's there with us in that suffering. We can give up control because God's in control. We're just called to be faithful. Results are 100% his department. That is above my pay grade. I can't bring results. I can bring fidelity as he gives me that ability by grace. And I can give up honor because I don't need to be honored because I am already ruling with Christ in the heavenly realms. C. John Somerville, professor emeritus at the University of Florida, does a thought experiment with his students. He imagines that there's a little old lady and there's no one else around, and she's got this huge purse. And his question is, of course, it suddenly dawns on you, you could rob her. Do you rob her of her purse, yes or no? And invariably the students all say no, but depending upon where he is and which group of students he has, when he asks them why is that, they give different answers. And it shows you some of the impact of Christianity, even on non-Christians, when they immerse themselves in a world where there are Christians leavening the loaf, being the yeast, working their way through the dough. Those who come from the secular West, we'd call it post-Christian West, Europe, United States, Canada, places like that, they're going to answer, well, of course we don't rob the little old lady, because think of what it would be like to have your purse stolen, your identity. I mean, think of how hard that would be for her to get all this stuff back and have to get a driver's license and all that, and think of how she might feel. And think about, what about her children, her grandchildren? They're probably people that she's using that money to take care of. And what would it be like to be them? And how bad would it be for them to go hungry or miss their rent payment because I stole money from their grandmother? Think of the kittens and the puppies in her neighborhood that she feeds and how they're going to go hungry because she can't afford to buy cat food and dog food. That's the way people in the secular West have been trained to think. When she asks people in many other parts of the world that have not had the gospel saturating it for centuries, the answer that he gets is still, no, you don't rob the little old lady. Why not? Well, because it would take a very weak person to feel they have to rob an elderly woman. It would bring dishonor on me. It would bring shame upon my family. Of course you don't do that, but do you hear the difference? This idea that you should put other people first and put yourself in their place and consider the impact on them is not native to the human race post-fall. It is a gift of Christianity. An ethical system that is based on honor, Somerville writes, is a self-regarding ethic, while one that's based on charity or love is an other-regarding ethic. With honor goes concentration on pride rather than humility, dominance rather than service, courage rather than peaceableness, glory rather than modesty, and loyalty rather than respect for all people, no matter how weak, generosity to one's friends rather than equality. This focus on love is an effect of the revolution that Jesus began 2,000 years ago. The gospel rejects honor and replaces it with love. My ancestors were Druids. They were all about getting honor and avoiding shame. But then, for 2,000 years, the gospel has been present in Great Britain and its former colonies, and just that impact has changed the way even those who don't know Jesus think. The gospel rejects the need for status because we already have status as children of God, and it rejects the lust for wealth because it's just money and it'll never satisfy the longing in our souls that can only be satisfied by God himself. I want you to imagine two highly respected and successful business people with impressive houses in the right part of town, lots of money. Both of them watch as a competitor comes in and takes away all their clients. They have debt to restructure. They have liabilities coming due, and both business people watch as their business folds. Both end up losing their homes. Both end up losing all of their wealth, both end up losing their careers, and both end up losing the respect of other people that their success had earned them. One of the business people built their entire identity on their success. And on the house that they could afford to live in, and the wealth that they had, and the things and the comforts and the respect that their wealth could buy. And so that business person has gone from someone to no one. The top of the totem pole to being a zero. And it crushes them. They've lost their identity. They've become a zero. The other business person lost all the same things, but that was a person who knew that they were a child of God, a sibling of Jesus, a co-regent over creation, and an heir of the kingdom of God. With the loss of success, wealth, and respect, were they hurt? Absolutely, they were hurt, of course. But does it crush that person? No. If Paul could sit in a Roman jail and say, it's Christ who strengthens me, and I can do this, then that business person can go through the loss of everything that made them significant in the eyes of the world, but their identity has not changed because they weren't looking to success or wealth or respect to justify their existence. And they're free, therefore, from their power to crush them when they're taken away. I remember, just myself, years ago when I was working on my PhD, I had done 3 years of coursework for it after getting my master's, and then I had done a year or two of language work, and then a year or two of comprehensive exams and all the stuff you do, and writing up a proposal, a prospectus for my doctoral dissertation. 50 pages, 20-page bibliography, spent half-time for a very, very long time. I was a full-time pastor at that point, but half-time student, and that's a time and a half. I don't recommend it, particularly not if you have a family. But God will enable you. You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. But I remember there's a point at which St. Louis University's theology department was going through an identity crisis. And they couldn't figure out what historical theology was, and they were all fighting among themselves. And so they looked at me, and my proposal was on Anglo-American evangelicalism in the middle of the 20th century, and some of them said, well, that's not theology, and others said, that's not history. A little bit biased for historical theologians, don't you think? But, nothing Protestant can be historical. And so it got rejected, and so I did another one, took another year, took me forever, and it got rejected. And I agreed with my advisor, Mike McClymon, that I'd just give it one more try, and then I was done. And if I don't get it, then what they would do is just give me a master's degree. It would be what we call an ABD, an all-but dissertation, so I wouldn't get the PhD. And I remember that I went through something of an identity crisis at that point. I remember at times wishing I was dead, being filled with despair. I was never suicidal, but I was not happy to be alive. And what God did through that, as I waited and waited and waited for months, is God lifted from me the burden of needing to be successful. And it got to the point where joy entered my heart for the first time in years. Absolute, true, genuine joy. And I was like, I don't need to write a dissertation. I don't need a PhD. God loves me just as I am, and I am secure, and I am already somebody in Christ. And I got to the point where I was really hoping and praying that they would reject it, because I didn't want to have to write a doctoral dissertation. For me, it was just going to be more work at that point. And then I got the phone call, and it's Mike McClymon, and he says, congratulations. And at that point, I knew God still wanted me to write the dissertation, and I got the PhD, and those letters mean absolutely nothing to me whatsoever, nothing. It's just a degree that I got from studying. But God got me to a point where I could lose my dream of being successful, and then he made me do it anyway. So the revolution of Jesus is not a political top-down insurrection. It's not carried out by force or coercion, but Jesus is saying, I am leading a different kind of revolution. And he does it through his actions, by going willingly to the cross. It's a revolution that actually reverses the world's systems. One final question. Again, it's all about asking good questions, and weird things in the Bible should always tell you that you need to ask a weird question. It's this. What's up with the guy running away naked in a garden? It's just a small detail at the end of the passage. What on earth is that doing there? A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. It's a small little detail, but why might Mark have included it? Remember where this is taking place. They're in Gethsemane. They're in a garden. A man naked in a garden, running away from God, running away from Jesus. Why mention that kind of detail? But for anybody with a familiarity, even a cursory familiarity with Judaism, they would think about how all this happened before. In Genesis, Adam, whose name means the man, was naked in the garden. God was there. He rebelled, and then he ran away and hid from God. It's a small detail, but a significant one in that it serves to connect the reader back to the account of humanity's fall into sin and misery, our rebellion against God and the subsequent loss of that relationship. Because here again, we see God in a garden and a man who's naked, who's running away from God. This suggests that what Jesus is here doing is parallel to what Adam had done in a different garden. You have two gardens, Eden and Gethsemane. You have two representatives of the human race, Adam and Jesus. Both of them are tested. Adam fails the test and is expelled from God's presence, and Jesus passes the test. And in so doing, we see now that he did everything that Adam did not do, and now he's about to open the way back to God. You see, there was always only one way to get back in the garden. There is only one way to get back to God. Only one path for which humanity could go. It's what Karen read earlier when Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden. God stationed an angel there with a sword going back and forth. And anybody who wants to get back into the garden will have to run through that sword. It's the sword of God's justice. If anybody wants to get back to God, back to Eden, back to salvation, the only way back is for someone to pass under that sword of God's justice. And on the cross, that is what happened. Jesus is going to his cross so that he, the sinless one, would pass under Eden's sword, and it pierced him straight through. And as he died on the cross, the curtain in the temple that separated humanity from God was torn from the top to the bottom, because God had now, through Christ, opened the door back into Eden. The sword had pierced its innocent subject. God had received the sacrifice of Christ as sufficient to forever reopen the path back to the garden, the path back to God. It's a true revolution. Uwe Holmer was frequently under attack by the East German government, particularly targeted by the dictator of East Germany, Erich Honecker. And even though Holmer was a faithful East German citizen, he was constantly under surveillance by the Stasi, the secret police. He at times was harassed. His children were denied an education. He was a target. And yet, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, in East Germany, small groups of Christians began to multiply. Christian cell groups spread even while the government persecuted the church. Little prayer groups established themselves in high-rise buildings, in offices, in factories, within the military, and most especially in the universities, whose students, with the exception of the theologians, were supposed to be atheists. The Christians, while relatively few in number, developed a stunning reputation among the populace of East Germany as the only people who were still willing and ready to defy the communist dictatorship. The Christians gained incredible respect, and yet the East German government viewed their growing popularity as an increased threat to be neutralized. The GDR State Council Chair Honecker increased pressure on the followers of Jesus and on Uwe Holmer specifically. The Stasi targeted his extended family as well. He prevented his family in West Germany from coming to visit him in order to isolate him. Uwe Holmer remained under surveillance until the end of the Honecker government as the Soviet Empire itself began to collapse late in 1989. And at that time, the East German dictator himself fell from his throne. He was arrested, change in government. He was put in jail for a month, only to then be hospitalized and released. But the government that replaced him confiscated the former dictator's house and all of his property. They kicked Erich Honecker out of his home and then out of the hospital. And after 30 years of almost absolute power within East Germany, power he used to persecute the church, the chairman of the State Council of the German Democratic Republic was homeless. 4 times, former dictator Honecker requested housing from the state. 4 times, the new East German government refused. No one would take him in. No one would offer him asylum. Too many people held too many grudges, and nobody could afford to be associated with a former dictator. Even those who might have shared his ideology could not risk providing the former dictator shelter out of fear of the potentially violent mobs that were then roaming the streets seeking revenge. One group stepped forward to offer Erich Honecker sanctuary. Pastor Uwe Holmer and his church stepped forward to offer Erich Honecker, former dictator, and his wife a room in Pastor Holmer's house. He had nowhere else to go. And the Christians in general, and Uwe Holmer specifically, were the only people in East Germany widely respected enough to know that their house would remain safe from rioters if they took in this dictator. In a sense, they were the only people who could do it. And they did. Protesters marched outside the pastor's house outside Berlin. They held signs demanding no forgiveness for Honecker. Holmer could only respond that Jesus had forgiven his sins against God and that Holmer therefore forgave Erich Honecker his 30 years of sin against him and his family. The gospel enabled him to live a radically different life, a revolutionary life in which the followers of Jesus willingly suffer persecution but do not lose heart, a revolutionary life in which the followers of Jesus forgive and even protect the very people who had persecuted them. Erich and Sigrid Honecker remained safe with Pastor Uwe and his wife from January until April of 1990. When he entered the protection of the Soviet military, who later brought him to Moscow, and then after the government fell there, he was tried in a reunited Germany, and after months of custody, was exiled to Chile. Erich and Margot Honecker, the former dictator and his wife, continued sending Christmas cards to Uwe Holmer and his wife every year from Chile until Margot died in 2016. Years after Erich Honecker's death, Pastor Holmer was the one who campaigned to transfer the dictator's remains from an urn on Margot Honecker's windowsill in Chile to a grave in Friedrichsfeld, Germany. The East German state that persecuted the Christians had collapsed, yet the true revolution was happening with those very same persecuted Christians who from the bottom up offered their hospitality and protection to the man who had hated them. Friends, that's a real revolution. That's the revolution of Jesus. Let's pray.